Ah, temp agencies. Those magical utopian places designed to provide jobs to the poor unemployed bastards of the world so they can live fulfilled, secure lives of financial stability. Except they're not. Since it's almost that time of year, happy May Day and welcome to the temp industry. Part the first. The temp industry, a history. Under the current structure of temp agencies, temps aren't actually legally employed by the companies they work at, but by the agency itself. This wasn't always the case, though. In the US, in the early 1900s, there existed employment agencies which would charge workers fees in exchange for placement at a company which would then directly employ them. This model, however, led to an abusive practice called fee splitting. The staffing agencies and companies would work together to routinely hire and then fire workers again, so these workers would have to continue to pay fees to the agencies over and over and over again in order for new job placements. Those fees would then be split between the staffing agencies and the companies. After the Second World War, government had put in place a maximum on the fees that workers could be charged. This is what led to the current structure of temps being legally employed by the staffing agency rather than the companies they actually work at. That meant that staffing agencies were now no longer the type of business subject to these regulations. Instead, they had now legally become a direct employer, technically outsourcing their workers to other companies. Since workers were no longer paying fees for job placement, companies now became the financiers of the temp business. Since these companies were now technically no longer the ones to legally employ workers, they also didn't have to pay them any benefits. Work could be terminated with virtually no notice, and companies were often able to negotiate lower prices with the agencies than if they would have to pay workers' wages directly. This also meant that temp wages were, and in some places still are, often lower than what a permanent employee makes. Unions were obviously none too happy about temp work. They feared that temp jobs could come to replace permanent positions, that temp workers could swoop in and replace permanent employees, so that gave the temp industry a bit of an image problem. That is, until they came up with a pretty nifty marketing technique. Women, particularly white middle-class housewives. In the 50s and 60s, temp work was aggressively marketed as employment for primarily white middle-class women, whose primary societal function was to be housewives, but who might want to take up temporary, not necessarily full-time employment in order to make some extra pocket money, or pin money, as that used to be called. Say your husband wasn't very inclined to buy you that new pair of shoes you really liked, you could just go and take up a temp job for a little bit in order to earn the cash to pay for them yourself before going back to your wifely and motherly duties. These women were supposed to be wives, mothers, homemakers first, hence not looking for permanent employment, and hence also not a potential threat as the replacement for permanent workers. This marketing was very much exemplified in the image of the Kelly Girls put forth by one of the first well-known staffing agencies, Kelly Services. Enter the 70s, and under the influence of economic recession and increasing globalization, temp industries aided the push towards a view of workers not as assets but as a liability. Permanent employees were a significant cost and prevented flexibility in an unstable market. Downstaffing became a thing where employers would heavily cut back on their number of permanent employees and replace them with less costly, more easily dismissible temps. This also increased the practice of payrolling, where companies would actually fire their permanent employees but then rehire them through temp agencies, essentially reducing them to lower risk, lower cost temp employees. This framework was also reflected in the rise of Kelly Services' image of the Never Never Girl. This Never Never Girl was a Kelly girl specifically marketed as someone who would never ask for a raise, never take a holiday, would never cost you a dime due to health problems, would never cost you in fringe benefits, would be easily droppable when the workload decreased, and so on and so forth. Mean and lean was the new catchphrase, which also gave rise to the phenomenon of permatemping, where temporary workers were kept in the same position at the same company for years without ever getting the equal pay, benefits and financial security of a permanent employee. This practice is still ongoing in the US, and there is a Vice News item about this which I've linked in another regions in case you want to learn a bit more. Part the second. Regulations. I live in Belgium and I have a few years of experience working at temp agencies here. And by that, I don't mean that I was employed through temp agencies at other companies. I mean I worked at temp agencies as a recruiter. So from here on out, I'm going to speak about my own experience within my own country. The temp industry in Belgium is subject to a lot of regulations that are not present in the US, and there's too little time to go into detail on all of them, but I would like to mention a few important distinctions. For one, the Belgian government has tried very hard to restrict the practice of permatemping. When I was 15 years ago and worked as a student at several companies, I did hear about temp employees who had been walking around there for a decade in the same job on a temp contract, but by the time that I started working at temp agencies as a recruiter in 2014, you couldn't actually do that anymore. Restrictions on temping duration exist based on motive for hire. There's temporary replacement, which can run for as long as the replacement is actually needed. There is temporary increase of workload, which can run for 6 months, then an additional 6 months if it is reported, and then maybe an additional 6 months with union approval. So 18 months in total. And then there is what we call influx. Influx is actually the motive a company should use when they have enough work to justify a new permanent hire. Under the motive of influx, a company can try out no more than 3 temporary employees with a cumulative contract duration of 9 months before a permanent hire has to be made. Of course, there is room for some loopholes here. Companies who actually do have room for a new permanent employee can try to get away with just hiring one after the other temp for about a year at a time, each motivated with the temporary increase of workload motive. Limitations are also placed on the use of consecutive day contracts. This means that if there's work for multiple days, employers should also issue contracts for multiple days at a time. The most commonly used type of contract in the temp industry, at least in Belgium, are 1-week contracts. This also goes for assignments that are supposed to run for, say, half a year. People will constantly get a contract for 1 week and then another and then another and then another, which is, of course, very handy for the company they work at, because if for some reason they have to drop them halfway through the time that they're supposed to be working there, they can just do that at the end of the week instead of having to write out a 6-month contract. So there's that. In any case, consecutive day contracts, not technically legal, unless a company can prove an exceptional, unexpected fluctuation in workload. That, at least, is the theory. In practice, I still come across temp job listings occasionally which explicitly state that they'll be working with consecutive day contracts for like the first 2 weeks to see how it goes, and that they'll then move on to week contracts. It's not legal, but it's there. Another big limitation is on strike breaking, and I can't fathom that this is still legal in the US, but it's very much not here. During a strike, it is absolutely not allowed for a company to employ temp workers. Temp agencies have to be informed of an ongoing strike. They then have to call back the already working temps, and they are absolutely under no circumstances allowed to provide the company with new ones. This is a thing that I have noticed that they are pretty strict about. Temps also have to be paid the same wage as permanent employees. That is to say, we have wage scales per sector and per age. So a starting temp should make the same as a starting permanent employee of the same age. This does not help the fact, though, that a permanent employee has the chance to build a career within the same company. They can grow and be there for years and get several raises and work themselves up. A temp constantly falls back to square one. If your contract with one company ends and you have to move on to the next one, no matter if you now have 10 years of experience in, say, retail, when you start anew at a new retail company, you will start at the entry-level wage for your age category. But I guess it does somewhat limit the practice of consistently underpaying temps even compared to their entry-level permanent colleagues though. So in all fairness, the Belgian temp industry is a somewhat less nefarious business in certain aspects than it is in other places, but does that make it a good thing? Unfortunately, no. Part the third. Capitalism. Temp jobs still get kind of a bad rep. I mean, the working class isn't stupid. They know extremely well that temporary work isn't going to give them any kind of security. The temp industry currently tries very hard to market itself on the concept of flexibility. You know, the idea that, ooh, you can try out a bunch of different careers to see what fit you. Ooh, you don't have to be tied down to one single employer all the time anymore. Ooh, the gig economy is good, actually. In reality, most people don't need flexibility. They need to know that they have financial security. They need to be sure that they will make rent next month. They need to not be constantly mentally bothered by the insecurity of whether or not there will be a job waiting to go back to for them next week. The real beneficiaries of this flexibility are companies. Companies who can outsource the legal responsibility for temps to staffing agencies. Companies who don't have to pay severance checks. Companies who can ditch and replace their temps on a whim because they get sick one day too often, or because they get pregnant, or because they complain too much about work conditions. What you need to thoroughly understand is that temp agencies don't work for you. The biggest misunderstanding I have encountered while working as a recruiter, and which I frankly still encounter when people learn that I used to do that, is this idea that temp agencies exist to help people find jobs. They don't. They exist to provide companies with the labor ingredient for their product. You don't pay them. Corporate does. A temp agency has an interest and a stake in you to the extent that you can easily cater to the whims of the companies who buy their service. And that means a thing or two for who gets hired and who doesn't. I've generally encountered two types of temps: the future permanent workers and the career temps. There is a distinct difference in who populates these categories for the majority, and that difference is not potential or work ethic. It's marginalization. This is difficult to put your finger on if you haven't been in the middle of it. One can theoretically understand the notion of classism and racism and ableism and so on and so forth, but to work as a temp recruiter is to be hit in the face with a sack of bricks of capitalist disenfranchisement of already marginalized people on the daily. A lot of these things individually are tiny and common, and they require adding up in order for you to see the injustice, and some stuff is a lot more blatant. I have seen slews of absolutely willing and capable people end up on the last resort pile. Ex-cons trying to pick their lives back up. Single parents who can, alas, only work day shifts because there is nobody to take care of their child before and after school, and they don't have the means to pay for childcare. People from abusive backgrounds and poor families who, for some reason, haven't been able to finish their education, and they have to find work in an economy where companies are disinclined to invest in teaching them. Poor people who can't afford a car and are excluded from the vast pool of companies with work sites that are nigh inaccessible by public transport, especially on early and late and night shifts. People with unstable CVs who haven't been able to hold down a job for longer than a year. They call them job hoppers. Employers assume that there's something wrong with them because they've only been able to temp so far. I once had an HR employee of a company that I recruited for come in and tell us that this woman that had just started working there through our agency didn't have to come back because this one morning her ex-boyfriend had kicked in her door and she was an hour late because she had to deal with the police. And then there is the blatant racism. So under Belgian law, temp recruiters can't actually hold off on sending through profiles to their clients based on anything other than being unqualified for the job. Now, that's all well and good, but the ultimate decision about who gets hired lies with the client company, not the staffing agency. I have encountered companies who literally point blank request that you send them white people. Legally, I have to tell them that I'm sorry, but I can only recruit based on qualifications and can't take race into account. Practically, if I piss off my client too much with one too many CVs of people of color on his desk, he might take his business elsewhere. And I have seen so many good, well-meaning people in this industry just stubbornly send out CVs and profiles of people of color and immigrants anyway, even though they knew it wouldn't make a fucking difference. I have also seen immigrant after immigrant CV go on the ad hoc pile. You know, the shitty last minute, one day unskilled labor jobs here and there. And some of us did that with the illusion that then maybe if we could place them somewhere for a day, we could then tell our bigger clients with bigger assignments that, oh, but this person has already worked for us, they're fine, we know, sure, they're an immigrant, but we can vouch. No average white person with similar qualifications would ever get that kind of treatment. I once sent this boy to interview for a job that had really specific profile requirements, really difficult shit to find. And this boy was perfect. Like, he was completely qualified to do the job, and he was polite and friendly, and he made a great first impression. And he was also black. So I sent him for an interview, and afterwards I got a call. So this client that I'd sent him over to, who had been on my case for a month about having to quickly find someone to fill his position, and that he knew it was hard, but you know, he needed someone quickly. This man calls me up and says that he won't hire that boy. And then he says, send me someone normal next time. You know, white. So I either had to say, yes, all right, I'm sorry, or potentially lose my client and potentially lose my job. And then I had to call up this boy and explain to him why he didn't get it. And I had two options. And one was to lie, and the other was to tell him the truth, and then be potentially responsible for a discrimination suit against my client, and potentially lose my client, and potentially lose my job. So I lied. I have had people of color and immigrants come in and cry at my desk after I interviewed them, saying that this was the first agency they walked into where they were actually asked questions, where people didn't just grab their CV and quickly scanned it and then sent them walking with this, we'll call you when we get something, you know, only to never receive a phone call. And sure, I interviewed these people, I did that, and they cried, because apparently not even that is afforded to them regularly. But it's not like I had the time to pick up the phone and call around and actively search for a job for them. I had targets to make, and these people were undesirable. They weren't easy to place. So we didn't try for them. You know who we tried for? White dudes with a vocational degree in like electromechanics or something. Those were gold. Those were the profiles that had more jobs than qualified people to fill them. Boy, did we try for those. There was always somewhere you could place them. Their wages were high, their prices were high, there was always a chance you just sign an entirely new client off of just providing a good tech profile for them, you know? This is the price of a profit-based system. This is capitalism, where people are second-rate because of their social background, because of their means, because of their mental health history, because of their identity. This is capitalism, where workers are disposable, expendable, where labor is yet another product ingredient that can be purchased as cheaply as possible, while we meanwhile casually trying to forget how that affects the bodies that provide that labor and how those bodies are human. In other words, socialism. Or get the fuck out. Hey there, comrades! A big thanks to my Patreons who support the making of these videos. If you thought this video was interesting or makes for a good contribution to society, please consider joining them and dropping me a monthly $1 or $2 to help me pay for rent while I make more of these, or send me a one-time donation on Ko-fi. You can find the links in the nether regions. Thanks!